Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for viewing the IGES Climate and Energy webinar series. I serve as the MC today. My name is Takashi Otsuka, Knowledge Communication Director at the IGES Strategy Management Office. Mr. Tamura, who's our usual host, will be joining us as speaker today. Today's theme is looking back on the G7 Hiroshima Summit, which was held from May 19th to 21st from the perspectives of environment and sustainable society. At IGES, we set up G7 2023 feature page in February, communicating our expectations for the Japan presidency G7 process in the forms of researchers' perspectives, policy brief, and issue brief. At the G7 Sapporo Ministers' Meeting on Climate, Energy, and Environment, many of our researchers participated as negotiation support staff, and soon after the announcement of the communiqué, while keeping confidentiality, based on public information, they were writing articles looking back on the conference. Some researchers took part in the T7 think tank process that was held concurrently as the G7 process, and the discussions that were taking place there were compiled in the policy briefs and issue briefs. Today's webinar will be almost the last piece of IGES information dissemination accompanying the G7 2023 process. The title is IGES Perspective on the G7 Hiroshima Summit Outcomes. We have three speakers who are experts on climate change and energy, biodiversity, and resource efficiency and circular economy, respectively. First half of the webinar will have commentary from the speakers, and after that, we will be taking questions from the viewers until 3 p.m. Today, once again, our motto is to make it clear, doing away with formalities, and make it concise. First, some housekeeping announcements. Today's webinar is broadcast in Japanese and in English. There is a language selection button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please select the language of your choice. Secondly, the presentation materials to be used today are uploaded on the IGES website. We will be attaching the URL in the chat box, so please check. Third, about your questions during the webinar, the questions can be sent from the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. There's also the like button in the Q&A. Even if you do not post your questions directly by yourself, if you find a question already listed that you are interested, please press the like button. During the Q&A session, we will be taking questions with the most likes first. And also, please be informed that we may answer your questions by text written by IGES researchers other than today's speakers. So you can ask your questions either in English or Japanese because we have simultaneous interpretation. Lastly, about the questionnaire. After the webinar, we would like you to give us your feedback through answering the questionnaire. So much for housekeeping. Let us get started. Let me first introduce the three speakers. First, Program Director of Climate and Energy of IGES, Mr. Tamura. Hello. Thank you very much for having me. Next, on biodiversity, the speaker is Mr. Andre Matter, Program Director for Biodiversity and Forests. Mr. Andre is appearing for the first time in this webinar series. Can you say a few words, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to join you, and I'm looking forward to contributing to the conversation.
Andre-san, ありがとうございます。3つ目の資源効率性、
Thank you, Andre. Next, the third topic, resource efficiency and circular economy. The speaker is Ms. Chika Aoki, Deputy Director for Sustainable Consumption and Production at IGES. Ms. Aoki, this is also your first time, right? Can you say a few words? Hello, everyone. My name is Aoki for Sustainable Consumption and Production. I would like to touch upon this topic today in this webinar. Thank you very much. So these are the three speakers in today's program. So without further ado, let us get started with Mr. Tamura. Can you give us a commentary Are you ready, Mr. Tamura, please?
Tamura-san, どう
Mr.
ぞ。
Tamura, you can now start.
はい、聞こえますでしょうか。
Can you hear me?
はい、お願いします。
Yes.
共有は
Please
され
start.
てますか？
Is my material being shared?
は
Yes.
い、
We see
改め
your
てよろしく
material.
お願いします。
Thank you for having me. From myself,
G7 サミットの成果について気候とエネルギー
G7 summit
観点
outcome
から
focusing
お話
on
ししたいと思います。
climate and energy.
でまずポイントになりますが、
First of all, the main
三つ挙げたい
points.
と思います。
I would like to focus on 3 points.
まず一つ目が、
The first
地球温暖
point
化による気温上昇を
is the temperature rise due to the global warming. We shall contain the rise of the temperature within 1.5 degrees. So toward the 1.5 scenario target, G7 are to demonstrate the leadership. At that point has been acknowledged. But at the same time, climate change, energy securities, as well as the geopolitical risk needs to be addressed in an integrated manner. Secondly, there are common approaches of the G7 and all the goal by sector. However, there is no strengthened measurement incorporated in the form of the new commitment. Now, the third point is recognizing the various pathway toward a net zero in 2050. Let me give you the further details of each of the points. First of all, in order to achieve the 1.5 degrees target and the leadership to be demonstrated by G7, the goals as a G7 urgency as well as the approaches were presented. As for the goal, loss of biodiversity, climate crisis, pollution issues, the energy crisis, these planetary issues need to be resolved simultaneously. And now the commitment to the 1.5 degrees target is repeatedly being emphasized in the communique. So the target for 1.5 degrees will present the overall framework. Individual actions and initiatives have to be consistent with this 1.5 degrees scenario, so it has a certain level of significance, and I will come back to talk about this point later as well. Next, as an urgency toward the goal of 1.5 degrees, emissions of the greenhouse gas compared to 2019 shall be reduced by 43% by 2030 and also 60% reductions by 2035. The urgency of doing that was emphasized. So what are the approaches to be taken? Against multiple challenges, interdependency or the synergies needs to be utilized. So the integrated approach needs to be taken. So that point was also emphasized. Now, from the viewpoint of integrated approach, what was emphasized is that assuming that there will be the involvement in 1.5 degrees, climate change, geopolitical risk, and all needs to be addressed, inclusive of the energy security. So simultaneous solution means that energy conservations, saving of the energy is a basic point that needs to be addressed. And also with the renewable energy, for the first time in the leaders' communique, a specific goal was introduced, 150 gigawatts for the offshore wind, as well as the solar power generations. 1 terawatt was clearly mentioned. This is not necessarily the new commitment. However, these are the aggregate of all the targets of the G7 countries. So this is not necessarily the new commitment. However, as you can see from this graph, take, for example, with regard to offshore, it's 6 times as large, and for the solar power generations aiming for 2.6 times as high. So considerable improvement is called for. The other point is how to handle the gas. As you can see here, LNG importance of LNG was emphasized to cope with the shortage of the gas. Appropriateness and importance of investing into the gas was emphasized. However, there are several points that we have to be mindful of because it comes with the conditions. We have to maintain the consistency and of the commitment in the Paris Agreement, and also we also have to work on for the reductions in the gas demand side as well. Now, appropriateness of the public support in the gas sector was also mentioned. However, it also comes with the condition Russian-derived energy as well as its independency and has to be phased out. With that conditions, as a temporary measures, this measure can be deemed as appropriate, but this is the wording in view of the European countries in mind. Now, let me move on to the next point. Take, for example, in 2011, G7 summit was held in UK, Carvis Bay. And in a phased manner, strong commitment was presented. So OECD, G20, or the COP discussions was led by G7. Take, for example, coal-fired power generation. The new international direct support should end. That was what is presented during the Carvis Bay summit. However, later on, South Korea, OECD countries, as well as China, also committed to these initiatives. Now, in Elmau summit on the subsequent year, ending the public and direct support on an international basis, if those are new into the fossil-based fuel energy sector. However, there is no stringent measures that was adopted during the G7 Hiroshima summit. Take, for example, by 2050, phase out of the fossil fuel was incorporated. However, this is just merely rephrasing the achievement of net zero by 2050. So this is not the new commitment. Now, for the power sector, in 2030, overwhelming decarbonization of the power sector was what was mentioned during the Carvis Bay summit. However, in Elmau summit, and by 2035, fully or the predominant decarbonizations were the wording used. So it was further progress. However, during the Hiroshima summit, it was just simply reaffirmations of what was committed at the Elmau summit. Now, about the phased out of the thermal power generation, there is no explicit deadline being set during Hiroshima summit. Why didn't Japan include more enhanced and specific commitments under its presidency? In a nutshell, there has been some delays for the domestic measures that we are taking here in Japan. This is my personal view. As you can see from the left graph, this is the emissions intensity in Japan. Of the G7 nations, Japan had the highest level of intensity, as is apparent from this graph. And as is shown on this middle table, all the G7 nations, except for Japan, has set the specific target when to abolish the coal-fired power generations, or they have specific target, except for Japan, and also GX Promotions Act. Carbon pricing was incorporated. However, its timing or its level is still insufficient. And so the level of contributions to the target for 2030 or the effect of the emissions reductions for 2035 is still unclear. Under such circumstances, can Japan take a lead to set forth more enhanced and specific commitment. No, Japan was not in the positions to lead such a discussion. However, when I mentioned of these points, well, you may say that the circumstances that Japan is in is different from Europe or from the United States. We should not confuse that point. So this leads to a third discussion point, which is the various pathway toward 2050 in view of the circumstances of different countries. It was acknowledged that various pathways do exist. And this point was emphasized during the press conference of the Prime Minister Kishida. And this is one of the key terms during the Hiroshima summit. To be more specific, what drew attention is take, for example, in the electricity sector, the use of hydrogen of the ammonia was mentioned, and also in the road sector, not just the electric vehicles, however, synthetic fuels, and various approaches are to be taken, which shall constitute the various pathway toward the decarbonization. And that point has been acknowledged. From this perspective, co-firing of the ammonia or the hydrogen into the existing power plants, as well as the new fuels are to be used, and that point has been acknowledged. However, what we have to be careful is that within the range, if it's consistent with the 1.5 degrees target. Now, from that viewpoint, the pathway toward 2050, yes, it is true that there are various pathways. However, as a pathway to achieve to be consistent with 1.5 degrees, we should admit that the range of such possible pathway is rather narrow. Now, we have to make an effort to reduce the accumulative level of the emissions. That point will be very important for this decisively important and 10 years. Therefore, that is why the hydrogen or the co-firing has been mentioned. Now, stated differently, there is the Japan's power transitions roadmap. What is expected in 2030? The emissions intensity compared to 1.5 degree scenario set forth by IPCC, there still is a big gap. Therefore, decarbonization's roadmap of the power sector may not be construed as being consistent with the 1.5 degree scenario. Therefore, toward the achievement of the 1.5 degrees goal, what are some of the roles expected of G7? Please focus on the right graph. And this is the CO2 emissions from the power generation sector. As you can see from here, toward 2025, we expect to reach a peaking out. In US and Europe, there is a considerable decline being expected. However, China and India is expected to grow. Therefore, the decrease in the Western nations will be offset by increase in Asian nations. So this is need to be reduced considerably until 2025. So G7 should make more effort to set forth the higher goal as well as to further enhance the international cooperation. I did not have time to talk about the other point, but just energy transition partnership is also another important point. Another important point is whether we can build a cooperation in addressing the climate crisis in the midst of the US-China conflict. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Tamura. Usually, I will be asking questions, but since we have 3 speakers today, we would like to concentrate our Q&A during the questions and answers session. So let us move on to the next presentation. Next speaker, in the area of biodiversity, what kind of progress we have been found will be explained by Andrea. At the G7 Hiroshima Summit, December CBD COP15 held last December, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework GBF was taken up in the Hiroshima summit, and positive attitude toward implementation was emphasized. And nature positive economy, new developments were also referred to. So can you talk about these developments in detail? Handing over to you, Andre, please.
Yeah, thank you, Otsuka-san, and hello again, everybody. The G7 Sapporo Environment Ministers Communiqué covered biodiversity in 10 different paragraphs, which are illustrated in this slide over here. What I will do is I'll go through these, and as I go through them, point out which components were incorporated into the subsequent Sapporo Leaders Communiqué. And in that way, hopefully you'll get a sense of the transition between the two communiques. So next slide, please. And actually, you can skip to the next one. Okay, so firstly, on nature-based solutions, there was a substantial paragraph here in the Sapporo Communiqué, but in the Hiroshima Communiqué, this boiled down to general support for funding for climate and biodiversity, using nature-based solutions as an example. So there was just one reference to nature-based solutions, and that was by way of making this connection between climate change and biodiversity. Next slide, please. Then on forests and land degradation, the G7 countries reiterated their commitment to halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by 2030, recognizing that agriculture is the driver of most global deforestation. And that's up to 90%, as indicated in the Sapporo Communiqué. To achieve this, the G7 committed to working with relevant international organizations, which were named in the Sapporo Communiqué, but not in the Hiroshima Communiqué. They said that they will, if appropriate, develop further regulatory frameworks or policies, which may include the introduction of due diligence requirements for commodities associated with deforestation and forest degradation. And then finally, they restated their commitment to tackling land degradation, desertification, and drought. But this particular point was not transferred to the Hiroshima Communiqué. So next slide, and you can actually skip 2 slides, please, to slide number 6. Thank you. Okay, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has already been mentioned by Otsuka-san. This is a very important document or framework, which, as mentioned, was approved by parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in December last year, which was 2 years later than intended because of COVID-19 and other complications. But this framework is very important because it is the basis upon which countries base their national biodiversity strategies. And so a lot of countries were waiting for this framework before going ahead with updating or developing their so-called NBSAPs. We'll mention that later again. And under this paragraph, the G7 countries welcomed the Global Biodiversity Framework and committed to its implementation through whole of government and whole of society approaches, and mentioning specifically women, youth, and indigenous peoples. Now, that specific mention didn't make its way through to the Leaders Communiqué. Also, those G7 members of the CBD, so the G7 includes the USA, which is not a signatory to the CBD. It's one of the very few countries that's not signatory to the CBD. So that had to be specified in the communique. But generally, the countries committed to updating their NBSAPs, which I just mentioned, and aligning them with the Global Biodiversity Framework, and called on other countries to do the same thing. And they committed to supporting in the initial communique, they committed to supporting more than 150 developing countries in revising their NBSAPs. But then in the Leaders Communique, that number was dropped. So they kept the commitment, but without the number, without reference to 150. Next slide, please. On nature positive economies, the G7 countries called on businesses to progressively reduce negative and increase positive impacts on biodiversity, and to reduce biodiversity-related risks and ensure sustainable patterns of production. They established a G7 Alliance on Nature Positive Economy, which was annexed to the initial, the Environment Sapporo Communique, and was referenced in the Leaders Communique from Hiroshima as a forum to share knowledge and create information networks in collaboration with various partners. And then the final point that I have on the slide there did not make its way through to the Leaders Communiqué, so I'll skip that one. Next slide, please. Okay, this one is on 30 by 30. This is a very prominent target within the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is about putting aside 30% of land and sea for conservation, or to protect 30% of land and sea. And the G7 countries reaffirmed their commitment to achieving this target and specifying that this would need to be achieved on both a national and a global level. So within countries, 30%, and at the global level in total, 30%. And they also committed to the global biodiversity target of restoring by 2030 at least 30% of areas of degraded ecosystems. So on the one hand, protection, on the other hand, restoration. Next slide, please. On invasive alien species, in the the Environment Ministers Communiqué, there was a fair amount of discussion and text on this, but just one mention in the Leaders Communiqué, which was that the G7 countries will enhance international cooperation on measures against invasive alien species. So there was just that one simple reference. Next slide, please. The one paragraph at the Environment Ministers meeting in the Environment Ministers Communiqué that didn't make its way through to the Leaders Communiqué at all was this one on data, information, and knowledge. So in the context of biodiversity, this topic was not covered in the Leaders Communiqué. Next slide, please. Resource mobilization was the topic of probably the most discussion of all at the Sapporo meeting, and there was a lot of text. But what it boils down to, the two kind of main points that I took out of it, both of them made it through to the Leaders Communiqué. First of them being that the G7 countries reiterated their commitment to increasing national and international funding for nature by 2025, although that year was not mentioned in the Leaders Communiqué. And they agreed to dedicate a significant amount of climate finance to maximize co-benefits and synergies in addressing climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So that particular text is taken from the Environment Ministers Communiqué. It was not stated as explicitly as that in the Leaders Communiqué, but the basic idea made its way through to the Leaders Communiqué. Next slide, please. This one is the second last one on the One Health approach. Firstly, just to explain for those who don't know, the One Health approach is an approach which is essentially an international call for transdisciplinary collaboration between professionals in human, animal, and environmental health. So those three, which has been ongoing for many years now, but it's really gained special prominence since COVID-19 began, as you can imagine. The text here that you see on the slide was not reflected much in the Leaders Communiqué, but that Leaders Communiqué stated that the G7 countries reiterate their commitment to addressing global health threats, including those exacerbated by climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, through integrated measures by applying a holistic One Health approach. So that was the one time that One Health was mentioned in the Leaders Communiqué, and it was not in the environment section, it was actually in the health section. So not part of the, not where the other biodiversity information was included. And then in both the Environment Ministers Communiqué and the Leaders Communiqué, there was a specific mention of antimicrobial resistance as a particular focus within the One Health topic. Next slide, please. Okay, so lastly, there was at the Sapporo meeting a lot of debate about whether to include a section on oceans, and the countries eventually agreed on this. So everything that I've discussed so far applies to oceans and land, but they decided that it was important to emphasize oceans. And I think this is partly because within conservation and ecology, very often the marine realm, which is most of our planet, gets left out of the conversation. So this is perhaps a way of emphasizing that. And the G7 countries welcomed the conclusion of recent negotiations on an internationally legally binding instrument under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as the BBNJ negotiations. That stands for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions. In other words, outside the economic exclusion zones. And the G7 countries called for its early entry into force and implementation. Then they also committed to 30% of sea area to be included as marine protected areas, in addition to what they had said earlier on that topic. And they committed to ending illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, but without alluding to the WTO agreement as mentioned in this slide. And I just remembered something I forgot to say earlier on. Don't worry about changing the slides, but on the 30 by 30 slide, there was mentioned about OECMs, which is other effective area-based conservation measures. So whenever you hear about 30 by 30 or protected areas, the conversation is about formally protected areas and also OECMs, which are areas which contribute to conservation but are not formally protected. Sorry for forgetting to mention that, but that applies to the oceans as well as the land. Okay, last slide, please. So just to wrap up, I thought it was interesting to note how faithfully the G7 countries adhered to the content of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So they were all pretty knowledgeable about what had been negotiated in Montreal for the Global Biodiversity Framework. As usual, there are some challenges in this negotiation because of the USA not being a signatory to the CBD, which is the convention under which the GBF was adopted and agreed on. But they worked together very collegially to come up with text which I think worked for all of the G7 parties. So hopefully this serves to, this communiqué serves to strengthen the implementation of the GBF, which is really what all biodiversity people are looking at the moment into the next, into the rest of the decade. But of course, just as with the GBF itself, success will depend on action rather than words. So this communiqué and the GBF set the scene for action, but now it's time for the world to take that action. Thank you very much.
Andre-san, 丁寧な解説をありがとうございました。
Andre-san, thank you very much for such an informative and meticulous commentary. I do understand that the biodiversity is becoming a very important challenge, and that has been recognized by the G7 leaders. So thank you very much for mentioning that as well. Now, US has signed, however, is yet to be ratified, and not so many people knows the reason why, but those participants to the webinar did understand the context of those. I'm glad that they could hear that point as well. Moving on to the third topic. The third topic is the resource efficiency and the circular economy related outcomes. On this field, what are some of the salient points? Ms. Aoki is the presenter. And please mention that. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Let me share my screen. Do you see my slides? Yes, we see your slide. Please start. So let me get started. I will be focusing on resource efficiency and circular economy, but I will also mention the plastics. It was not necessarily mentioned within the resource and efficiency and circular economy topic, but this is also very important. So I will also talk about plastic. With climate change and biodiversity, let me first of all set out the differences in agenda. The resource efficiency and circular economy in the General Assembly of the UN or at the GM Fora, there are three planetary crisis, or the triple planetary crisis is a term that is used. Climate change, loss of diversity, and pollution. This is a very important initiative to address these crises. the use of the natural resources as well as the well-being needs to be decoupled. So from that perspective, resource efficiency as well as circular economy is said to be very important. Now, please focus on the graph on the right-hand side. Resource efficiency, circular economy, climate change, and biodiversity, and their relationship. To scientifically assess the resource efficiency, there is an international resource panel. According to their assessment, the virgin resources, mining and processing, and what are some of the factors for the environmental impacts? Now, mining and processing account for 50% of the climate change, and this is the air pollution, about 30%, biodiversity, particularly water, and on the right-hand side is mainly focusing on the biodiversity. And so there is a relevancy of about 90%. Therefore, we have to change our patterns of the productions and consumptions so to make it into a sustainable way. So from that perspective, a circular economy is very important. At Paris Agreement, there was a mentioning of the importance of this resource efficiency and circular economy. And in the remote target for 2030, sustainable productions or the reductions of the waste-related goals were also included. Now, based on these, first of all, from Hiroshima Leaders Communiqué, resource efficiency and circular economy sector-related portions are picked up. The enhancing resource efficiency and circularity along the value chain is instrumental in contributing to achieving the goal. That point has been acknowledged by the communique, and also there is a big role to be played by the businesses. Now, the principle is there to show the guidance and to the businesses and to enhance the circularity along the supply chain. Take, for example, critical minerals and all the raw materials. It has to be sustainable as well as the efficient recycling and collections also needs to be done. It is not just about the collections and recycling and take, for example, to put the product into the services or to prolong the life so that the primary resource usage can be reduced. That is also very important. However, collections and recycling was one of the focal points among the G7 leaders. Now, talking about the plastic, by 2040, additional pollution shall be reduced to zero. This is the ambitions, and the common understanding has been acknowledged. So against the plastic pollution, a comprehensive life cycle approach needs to be taken. And so from taking of the raw materials to dumping of the materials, take, for example, releasing into the ocean, there has to be some countermeasures taken. And also the natural circulation is also very important. And we have to step up our activity. This has become the common understanding. Now, in order to end the plastic pollution, internationally legally binding instrument needs to be drafted, and there is the intergovernmental process underway. And the meeting was held very recently. I also attended that. Safe and sustainable circular economy needs to be promoted from the viewpoint of ending the plastic pollutions. This is the terminology mentioned by many of the countries. Therefore, from the viewpoint of plastic issues, in order to address the plastic pollutions, there is an important role to be played by the circular economy. This is the common understanding on the global basis, not just among the G7 leaders.
Now, the communique of climate ministers, critical minerals and raw materials, environmental impact of was emphasized here, that recovery and recycling is important, reducing the dependency on critical minerals, issues with respect to environment, as well as resource security was emphasized. Now, with respect to climate change, paragraph 72 in energy, they also make references to critical minerals, decarbonization technologies, including batteries. Various minerals are being used. So from there, critical minerals, important minerals for G7, that was recognized. And at G7 meeting in Germany from those days, this was already made clear. And after the Ukraine crisis and vulnerability of supply chain drew a lot of attention. That was another component in the background. So critical minerals, in addition to critical minerals, circular economy and resource efficiency principles were adopted. You started climate change responses, but you don't know what to do about circular economy. Many businesses feel that way, but this is a guideline to give them an understanding of which direction they should be headed. So in G7, both the public and private sectors are to work on circular economy, and that ambition was signaled. Yesterday, at the Central Environment Council said that the private-public partnership for circular economy was mentioned there in the council, and decarbonization of wastes, as well as decarbonization of value chains. There was also an agreement on that. In addition, measuring circularity of value chain and information sharing and utilization, especially digital product passport in the EU, which covers all of the value chains, to environment information, including recycled goods, are to be shared. That's the idea there. So that was the basis for this, and there was an agreement for that importance of measuring and information sharing on the value chains circularity. Now, Energy Efficiency Alliance or Resource Efficiency Alliance of the G7, there's such a scheme to work together. So there could be circularity measurement as well as comparable indicators. So there was common understanding reached, and also enforcing international cooperation. Value chains are global, so developing countries will be involved. So MDBs, their role in circular economy and their integration was also discussed. Now, CEREP, circular economy and resource efficiency, there are 6 principles: top management commitment, as well as climate change, biodiversity, and pollution reduction will be integrated with circular economy. And be it decarbonization, you need to transform the economic system. What are the risks? And through that transformation, what are the opportunities? You have to identify risks and opportunities. That was also emphasized in these principles. And there is going to be transition to circular and resource-efficient businesses, and there has to be enhancement of monitoring and reporting, and there will have to be multi-stakeholder partnerships and engagement, enhancing public-private partnership, engagement. All of these matters were emphasized in the CEREP principles. The last one, summary. To the 3 planetary crises, to respond to them, the importance and the role of resource efficiency was emphasized, especially environmental impact, as well as from the perspective of resource security. You need to have circular economy of critical minerals. The importance is recognized. And as part of domestic policy, there is already circular economy roadmap, as well as resource autonomous economic strategy was developed. Information dissemination platform is already to be established, and the roles of businesses was also emphasized. But of course, because this is circular economy, there are various stakeholders, especially collaboration between the public and the private sectors are important. And J-Force, circular economy partnership, comprising government, private sector, and academia has already been established, and the role of finance was also emphasized. So in this context, changes in the business model and the economy and the society will be forced in a way, but what kind of products, what kind of businesses can be carried out is something that we need to think about. So this could be a trigger to start thinking about those need for changes. Thank you very much. That's all.
3つの地球危機に絡めてですね、循
Thank
環
you
経済
very much, Ms. Aoki. You talk about the triple planetary crisis, pollution, climate change, biodiversity. In relation to that, there is the need to make a transition to the circular economy, and that is reflected into the communique. And thank you very much for making those commentaries. Without further ado, why don't we move on to the Q&A session? Well, we received so many questions, but the time is limited. But let me pick up the ones with highest numbers of likes. But we would like to strike the right balance of the three different presentations that we have heard. But before I jump into the questions, vast majority of the questions are in Japanese. So just one reminder to Andrea-san. So let me switch it to English.
What I'm going to do is try to have a balanced allocation for the question and answers in the three fields. And there's two important questions coming for the biodiversity. And one is in English so that you could check it in the Q&A, which is about the how you could possibly get some accurate data about the company's action activities and its result in the biodiversity or nature conservation. And the other nature-based, the other biodiversity-related question is a similar one. The person who's following the development on the TNFD, financial disclosure, as well as the science-based targets, but he'd like to know more about what's going on in the international society with regards to the international standards, as well as the efforts related to that. So I'll come back to you. So that please give it a thought and come back. I'll come back and please give us an answer. And before. すいません。では、日本語に移って、まず気候変動
So allow me to once again switch back to Japan. First of all, there is a question to Tamura-san with regards to climate change. There are a couple of questions, several questions. The question that had the highest level of interest is the ammonia co-firing. How this is perceived by other countries? We want your candid opinion. Now, ammonia co-firing is related with the coal-fired power generation. But there are some related questions, so let me pick up some of the questions. First of all, perceptions on ammonia. Within G7, there is a very severe look. That's my understanding, particularly from the European countries. They were critical or doubtful. US are more neutral. That's how I understood. Non-G7 countries, South Korea has slight interest in ammonia co-firing, and other Southeastern Asian countries. Well, there are some countries that Japan is proactively trying to sell, and if Japan provides the funds as well as technology, they show some interest in undertaking that. That seems to be the situations for the ASEAN, some of the ASEAN countries. But in any case, ammonia co-firing technology, what I heard is that up until a 40% level to the co-firing, technically speaking, there is a good prospect. That is what I heard from the manufacturer. No, still with 40%, 50% level compared to the natural gas, the emission intensity is high, and that level is still not sufficient. So it comes with a lot of challenges. Now, against NOx or N2O, manufacturers say that that's being handled. However, I doubt to what extent that is the case. Within the communique of the G7 leaders, N2O, greenhouse gas, as well as NOx, pollutant needs to be avoided. So that is a caveat written in the communique. Under such circumstances, well, let me mention one point. No deadline set for abolishing of the coal-fired power plant, and this is related with the ammonia use. For the old coal-fired power plant, it will be phased out. But large size, more efficient, newly built ones will be replacing the older facilities. As a result, in 2030, 90% of the power generations will be accounted for by a coal-fired power generations plant. Now, with the coal-firing or the monofuel combustions, will replace that. And with the CCUS, do the decarbonization. That seems to be the pathway the Japanese government is envisioning. However, there are some uncertainty when Japan will be able to reach that level. Therefore, decarbonizations of the coal-fired power plant specifically was not supported by the Japanese government. That is it for myself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tamura. So next, I'd like to hand it over to Andre. Biodiversity question. I would like you to answer the questions related to that. And Aoki-san, we have a number of questions about the circular economy. So if I could hand it to you later. Andre-san, please.
Yeah, thanks, Otsuka-san, and thank you to those who asked the questions. So the first question, I ran it through Google Translate as well, so I'm hoping that I understand correctly. But the questioner asked about, well, the fact that companies work on both climate change and biodiversity. We've got TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and now there's TNFD, which is trying to do the same kind of thing with biodiversity. But the questioner was asking about standards in particular. And the one important thing to say here, I can go into a bit more detail if necessary, but the International Standards Organization, ISO, which I think is probably familiar to everybody through the 9001 and 14001 and other standards, environmental standards, they have recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, begun to develop a biodiversity standard. And IGES is actually coincidentally involved in supporting Japan's contribution to that, and the Japan committee that's taking part in that effort. So that's really the most important thing I think to say about that. The other question was about sustainability data, and the questioner noted that even Scope 3 data of companies cannot be collected adequately. This is not my area of expertise, but as far as I understand, Scope 3 emissions are the vast majority of emissions in most cases, so somewhere around 80 or 90% of emissions, and they follow emissions down the supply chain. So there are things over which a producer has very little control, and hence they're also very difficult to measure. So the questioner, I think, has already recognized that fact. Unfortunately, with biodiversity, this could be even more complicated because biodiversity is, generally speaking, a lot more complicated than climate change. So we'll see how this pans out, but it's going to be a substantial challenge. And biodiversity is also a few years behind climate change when it comes to this kind of engagement with the private sector. So I hope that's an adequate answer, but those are my thoughts for now. Thank you very much.
アンドレさん、ありがとうございました。はい。それでは、
Thank you, Andre-san. Now to Ms. Aoki, please comment on the circular economy related questions. So let me respond. By government adopting, what were some of the new moves, or how about the regulation changes? Those are the questions that we have received. As I mentioned during my presentation, there is a roadmap for the circular economy and all the plan for the resource efficiency published by the MITI and others, and there are many businesses. In order to advance with the circular economy related activities, what support is required is also mentioned. And also, there is a review of the law on the resource efficiency is also mentioned, and there may be some policy-related movement in that field as well. On the other hand, the policy in Europe is showing some advancement. Financial-related measures are showing some advance, and for the plastic pollutions, the producers' obligation is now being discussed. So in one way or the other, international initiatives or the initiative by the different countries may give an impact to Japan as well. Now, moving on to the second point, recycling, energy saving, not only that, but changing of the business model may be required. Now, the wording of the communique uses recycling, but with syrup to make the product into the service or the repairability is being emphasized. Realistically speaking, we usually start out by collections and recycling, but when we talk about the decoupling, reductions of the primary energy shall be what you should focus on to consider the actions to be taken moving forward. Now, resource efficiency, as well as the difference to resource and productivity. Well, the latter is about the indicator indices. Resource efficiency is more commonly used terms nowadays. Circular economy, it may be inclined toward a certain directions and in view of the package deal. However, that seems to be the global trend. But on the other hand, recycling or reductions of the waste, appropriate processing are the terminology that is incorporated in the document. So this is not forgotten. And DX, DPP, digital product and passport and its relationship at MITI, circular economy information platform is now being built. So there will be the further review to be made. That is it from myself.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aoki, and thank you to the three speakers. Now at G7, there was an interesting question raised. At Sapporo's communique, there are things included. Just because it's not reflected in the leaders' communique, the level of commitment is not necessarily lower. Is that right? That was the question. No, I don't think the level of commitment is lower just because it's not included in the leaders' communique. The summit communique, the number of words and the pages is limited. Compared to that, ministerial meeting is more. And for the leaders' communique, only the very important ones are to be included. But physically speaking, not all of them can be included. So at each minister's meeting, what was included in the communique? G7 countries, governments have already made a commitment. So necessary budgets are to be allocated as needed. That's my understanding. Now, Hiroshima summit, not only Hiroshima, but if it goes to the summit level, the leaders level, and if it is going to be taken up in a big way there, means that to the people in the society, the communication is being made that these are the urgent messages. That's the message there. So working on those challenges would get the support of the public opinion, making it easier to work on those agendas. So going to the original question, the commitment level of countries, is it lower just because it's not in the leaders' communique? I don't think so. But Aoki-san, Tamura-san, Andrea-san, if you have different thoughts about this, please let me know. Okay? Okay, so I think it's exactly time. Thank you so very much for many, many questions. We weren't able to take up all the questions. Sorry about that. Climate change and energy, biodiversity, resource efficiency, and circular economy. We had three researchers in the respective areas giving us their commentary. Thank you so very much. Lastly, some announcements about the future climate change webinar series and the questionnaire. The next theme and the dates are not decided, but as soon as we know, we put that on our homepage and we let you know through the mailing list as well. And the past webinar videos are also posted on the homepage of IGES, so please view the past webinars as well. Now the questionnaire. After the webinar is over, it will open up on your screen. In order to improve our webinars going forward, please give us your feedback. If you are interested in certain themes, also please let us know. Your feedback is going to be useful in making improvements for our webinars. So just a simple feedback will be appreciated greatly. With this, we would like to conclude the webinar series, IGES Perspectives on the G7 Hiroshima Summit Outcomes. Thank you so very much for your participation.